have spoken of the American century. I say that the century on which we are entering can be and must be the century of the common man.
A radical redistribution of economic power.
I mean, we know that racism is just a byproduct of capitalism. Everything would be all right if everything was put back in the hands of the people.
We need a government that will make sure Americans are taken care of and organize the economy to serve the people, not the profits of a wealthy few.
We now have the techniques and the resources to get rid of poverty.
We got to start getting out there with the people.
Get out of the movement and get to the masses.
We need a government of action.
Hey folks, so I'm here with a longtime friend, Ramiro Funez. Ramiro Funez is a communist content creator. He has traveled to many countries around the world. He's well versed in Marxism and historical and dialectical materialism. He's an expert on Latin America, and he has just gotten back from Nicaragua, which is a socialist country in Latin America headed by the Sandinistas. Ramiro, take it away. Why did you go to Nicaragua? What did you see there?
So I went to Nicaragua for a delegation with the Sanctions Kill Coalition, which is a combination of the ATC, the Asociación de Trabajadores del Campo, the Association of Peasant Workers, and several other organizations based in Nicaragua and in the United States. Code Pink as well, I think a few other groups, anti-imperialist groups, and the delegation was called Sanctions Kill. And the purpose of the delegation was to bring attention to the impact of unilateral sanctions by the US government against the government of Nicaragua, the people of Nicaragua. We tend to think of Venezuela and Cuba when we think about US regime change in Latin America. And unfortunately, Nicaragua does not get enough solidarity and support from even within the US left when it comes to sanctions. But Nicaragua is one of the countries that's being sanctioned, along with other countries around the world, Zimbabwe, countless others that we can go on and on about. And basically, the purpose of the delegation was to bring light to the impact of sanctions, not only on the government and the economy, but on everyday working class people. Nicaragua historically, up until just a few years ago, has historically been one of the poorest countries in the Western Hemisphere, after Haiti. Right now, Honduras is the second poorest country in the Western Hemisphere after Haiti. And historically, Nicaragua has always competed with Honduras for second place in that position. So we're talking about a country that's extremely impoverished, that has a history of colonization, of imperialism, one of the poorest in the region, that has been subjected to sanctions. So sanctions are a very big deal. They severely impact the society of Nicaragua. And so we went on this delegation from March 13th to March 24th. Now, originally, we were supposed to go on the delegation from February 13th to February 23rd. However, we had to reschedule it. And one of the reasons we had to reschedule it is because American Airlines decided to cancel all flights to Managua. So that was a very big deal. So even as we were trying to get to Nicaragua to shed light about sanctions, we were initially unable to do so because of sanctions and these sort of economic crackdowns that we don't really hear about in the news that often. But something like that has a big impact on the economy of Nicaragua, because now it's forced to rely on other airlines for travel between the US and Nicaragua. So we had to move it for March. We went there for about a week and a half, and it was a very beautiful experience. I mean, I can go into some of the details later on, but for me, it was beautiful to see the constructive side of socialism. I think so many times within people who are new to socialism or learning about revolution, they know about the Sandinista revolution of the 70s, right? Or they know about the epoch of armed struggle in general of the 60s and 70s, the guerrilla fighter with the guns, you know, the romantic side of revolution. And that's something that in Nicaragua, they certainly uphold and appreciate and they admire, and that's certainly part of their history. However, this is what they call the second phase of the Sandinista revolution that they talk about. This is the period of construction. Right now, the government is called the government of unidad y reconciliación, of unity and reconciliation, of working with the national champions, as Russian President Vladimir Putin would say in Russia, working with the big producers in the economy to build a socialist society, to build a society that has a developed infrastructure, to build roads. And this is unfortunately corresponds with the lack of support from some of the US left. Once people put down the guns, once people started switching revolution, the words of revolution for reconciliation, unfortunately you had some people who kind of backed off from supporting the Sandinista revolution.
Let's do kind of a history overview, because a lot of people didn't know about this. It's pretty wild. I didn't hear the name Oliver North until I was a freshman in college. It was too recent to be history, and too old to be current events. So Nicaragua, 1978 or 79, they had a revolution, right? And the Sandinista party took power, right? 79. So then the USA starts funding terrorist groups called the Contras to go to Nicaragua and chop people's heads off and burn buildings. And it's a lot like what they're doing in Syria right now, right? I mean, it's like the country has a socialist government. We send terrorists and thugs in there. All over the world, there's a movement of people that are morally opposed to this, because the Catholic Church is involved because they're killing priests and nuns. So the U.S. Congress passes a law, no more funding of thugs and terrorists in Nicaragua. So then Ronald Reagan breaks the law and sells missiles to Iran and uses the money to give it to the terrorists and thugs in Nicaragua against the law, right? Later, we find out those terrorists and thugs in Nicaragua that were getting all the weapons and support from Ronald Reagan and the U.S. government. We later find out they're the people that brought crack to the United States, and they're the people that are responsible for the crack epidemic. So the CIA was involved in the drug trade. After the Soviet Union falls, they have an election in Nicaragua. Sandinistas lose, and then they lose the election, so they step down. And then everyone goes, wait, I thought they were brutal dictators. How could they step down? That doesn't fit. And so it turns out Ronald Reagan was lying the whole time. They step down after they lose the election. But then, fast forward to 2006, they get reelected, and the country starts moving towards socialism again. That's Nicaragua, right? That's a long, complicated history, and our government is heavily involved, and people don't know about this. So where is Nicaragua now? You talked about they're on the path of construction. They're facing these sanctions. What did you see in Nicaragua when you were there? What did you see that made it a socialist society? What did you see that the U.S. is doing to them? Give us the lowdown.
So since 2007, I think that's a great breakdown of the history of Nicaragua that's very complex and spans many decades and centuries. From 2007 onward, President Daniel Ortega and Vice President Rosario Murillo have been in power in Nicaragua. They are popularly supported. They have some of the highest approval ratings in Latin America and the Caribbean. Since 2007, Nicaragua has been in the process of construction. Again, the slogans changed because the Sandinista movement of the 70s and 80s was in a very different time period, as you mentioned, where they were in constant battle, constant struggle from the Contras, from the US government, from the right-wing Cubans who were also mobilized in Nicaragua. And so from 2007 onward, let's also remember the context of the pink tide in Latin America. You have Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, Fidel Castro, Raúl Castro. You have the creation of ALBA, the Bolivarian Alliance for Our America. So Nicaragua from 2007 onward is in a period of reconstruction, of reconciliation, of unity, of trying to win over the national bourgeoisie, the sectors of society that historically sided with the counter-revolutionaries, but were able to witness the impact of neoliberalism. Before I get to the context of what's going on today, I think it's important to underscore that Nicaragua has a very interesting history with neoliberalism, because in 1990, you have the election of Violeta Chamorro with the UNO coalition. She represents right-wing neoliberals, privatized everything, immediately rolled back all of the gains made by the Sandinistas in the 80s. And so in the 90s, the Nicaraguan people saw and understood what neoliberalism does. They saw immediately how socialism can be immediately reverted back to neoliberalism, privatizing education. All of the life expectancy rates went down, the literacy rates went back down. So the people of Nicaragua are very familiar with neoliberalism. And so part of that slogan of 2007 onward of unity and reconciliation is also nunca más neoliberalismo, never more neoliberalism. And so what does that mean? That means investing in public programs. That means investing in public education. Right now, Nicaragua has one of the best healthcare systems in Central America. A lot of people tend to think of Costa Rica in Central America as the quote unquote Switzerland of Latin America or Central America. But Nicaragua, there's actually, when I was there, I saw a lot of people from Costa Rica, retirees from the US, who were actually going to Nicaragua for healthcare. I got a COVID test that was immediately the same day. It was extremely efficient, low cost, run by the government. They don't allow private companies to monopolize the COVID test industry. There are hospitals everywhere. They build hospitals and clinics from the countryside to the Caribbean coast, all over the country. Education is free and universal. They have public schools everywhere. And instead of eliminating private schools, they just invest more in public schools. So the public schools are where the bulk of the students go, and they have great education. When we talk about infrastructure, that's a big part of it as well, because Nicaragua, being in a Central American country that is mountainous, that is divided geographically between the Pacific mountain area where most of the people live and the autonomous Caribbean coastline where less people live, it's less densely populated. You have the Miskito indigenous people, African descendant people living there. So one of the key programs of the Sandinista government from 2007 onward has been infrastructure, creating roads that link the west coast of Nicaragua, where most people live, to the east, so that the people, farmers, agriculturalists on the Caribbean coast can sell their products in the west and vice versa, linking the country in two, right? So that's been a big part of it, the infrastructure. The roads are amazing. You can travel around the country very easily, developing internal flights so that, flights can go from east to west. In all sectors of society, I think the most important sector that has been part of the reconstruction period from 2007 up until now, which I think is a big and important part, is the food sovereignty. Nicaragua is one of the most food sovereign countries, not only in Latin America, but in the world. Over 80% of what Nicaraguans eat on the day-to-day basis is produced locally within their province. So they've created supply chains and supply systems where you don't need to rely on US imports or multinational companies for food. You get fresh produce, fresh vegetables, fresh food from your communities, and the government creates incentives for businesses to work with local farmers for food allocation. So just kind of recapping the 2007 onward, that's one of the biggest gains and successes of the Sandinista revolution.
And it makes them less vulnerable, because that's how the USA has been able to hurt Venezuela so bad, is by messing with their food imports and such. And that's a strategic thing that they've done. Now, you were there though, right? I mean, tell us what you saw. Tell us sites you went to. Tell us Nicaraguans you spoke to. Right? Give us the eyewitness account.
So the delegation was broken down into three parts. The first part was getting a formación, what we call formación política, political formation. We had members of the ATC, which is the Peasant Worker Association that was formed in 1980 after the Sandinista revolution. And so the ATC was created amid the land redistribution programs. The Sandinista government revolution redistributed land that belonged to the Somoza family dictatorship, handed it over to the peasants who worked the land, and created this association of peasants to learn how to not only defend their lands, but to grow, create produce. So we had representatives of the ATC and the different institutions in Nicaragua teach us about the history of Nicaragua. We spoke to some of the Sandinista youth who spoke to us about the 2018 protests and the media war and how the media played a part in that. So that was mainly in Managua the first few days. And so we got to meet as well former combatants with the Sandinista front who now have key positions in the ATC. So that was really inspiring to hear their stories of revolution, of armed struggle, and now in the period of construction. The second part of the delegation, which I think was very beautiful, was heading to the northwestern province of Esteli. Now, Esteli is a department that borders Honduras, where my family's from. And actually, it was interesting for me because my dad is from the province of Choluteca, which borders Nicaragua. So think of it as like, Texas, and, let's say like Monterrey, Mexico, like, two borders. Society. So we actually stayed with a family in the countryside in the middle of nowhere. And it was a really cool experience to grow food with them, to learn about how they experienced the Sandinista revolution. They spoke about how under neoliberalism, they were unpaving roads. You talk a lot about unpaving roads in the US, which I think is one of the most horrible things that we see under neoliberalism. They were doing the same thing in the 90s under Violeta Chamorro's government. He saw immediately how once the Sandinistas came back in 2007, they were building roads, they were building water projects, they were sending officials with the ATC to the different patches of land to teach campesinos how to grow new products, how to grow things that are in season, and not to grow monoculture plantation. So, for example, one of the big problems in neoliberal countries like Honduras is that where my family's from, you'll see huge farms where they grow palm oil leaves, palm trees where they grow palm oil, and you see them grown military style in aisles, and they're completely for the purpose of selling it abroad in the international market for other countries. It's not like that in Nicaragua. They have plantains, coffee, fruits, vegetables. They diversify their plots of land, and we got to live with the campesinos for a few days to see how they go about that process of shifting their agriculture. We saw the schools that they built in their little village in Esteli, built by the Sandinista government, the literacy brigade that went there, both in the 80s and also again in the present era. So that was kind of the second part of the delegation, was going to the countryside to see the campesinos, the successes of the Sandinista revolution in the countryside. We also, when we came back to Managua from Esteli, we went to a beautiful town called, or a beautiful neighborhood called Puerto Salvador Allende, named after the Chilean Marxist president who was overthrown in 1973. A beautiful area where they reconstructed businesses, small businesses with local restaurants, and they basically made it into a little party area where people go there on the weekends. It was beautiful to see that, because in other Latin American countries, when we think about nightlife, when we think about the downtown commercial areas, it tends to be dominated by multinational companies. It tends to be dominated by foreign food, by foreign music. And going to central Managua on a Saturday night, seeing that the restaurants where people go to are Nicaraguan restaurants, they're eating Nicaraguan food, they're listening to Nicaraguan music, and there's elements of patriotism embedded into their revolution. And lastly, the third part of the delegation was very interesting, and I think was very eye-opening, especially for the conversations we have about the synthetic left, which, especially with your excellent work on the synthetic left. We went to the Caribbean coast of Nicaragua, to the northeastern autonomous region. Now, what's interesting about Nicaragua is that we hear all of these propaganda stories from the mainstream media, but also the synthetic left institutions, claiming that indigenous people are repressed, that they have no rights, that their lands are being taken from them. And it's just complete nonsense. Like, I saw it for myself. First of all, if you even look at a map, the two biggest regions are autonomous regions run by the Miskito indigenous peoples. They run those areas. When we landed there, we had to present our passport. We had to apply for like a little domestic visa to the indigenous communities. So they run that. Like, all this idea that, you know, that the indigenous peoples are marginalized is complete nonsense. They run those, the whole coast, actually the like over 50% of the country's autonomous region, and protected rainforest, protected jungles. When we flew down to the coastline, we see like nothing but jungles, nothing but unprotected areas, preserves. And it was beautiful to see that. So that's one misconception that right away was just kind of immediately thrown out.
Well, that blows my mind, because if you would read American coverage, you think the Sandinistas, they're just, they're cutting down all the trees. It's like Fern Gully, right? It's the Lorax, and they're just cutting down the trees, and they're, telling all the indigenous people, we're going to force Western Marxism down your throat. Shut up with your primitive You get this impression that they're this genocidal, anti-environmental government in Nicaragua. And you're telling me that they have handed over 50% of the country to the indigenous groups. You have to get a special visa just to go into the area that the indigenous people control. They are preserving the rainforest. This is the exact opposite. This is the exact opposite of everything you read in the New York Times about Nicaragua. This should blow everyone's mind. If you want any proof that mainstream U.S. media is lying shit, here you go. This is amazing. Keep talking, Ramiro. Tell me more.
And that's not even the craziest part about it, is that we found out when we visited there. We visited the head of the Department of the Autonomous Atlantic Coast in a city called Bilwi. So originally it was called Puerto Cabezas, which means the head port in Spanish. They renamed it Bilwi, which is the Miskito language. So they renamed the areas into the indigenous names. And also we learned that the government of Nicaragua has to pay a rent to the indigenous tribes, the Miskito tribes, to even govern there. So any decision, they have to actually lease the space from the indigenous communities, and that money goes to them. So like this concept that they're being kicked out of their lands is complete nonsense. The Nicaraguan government is actually paying the indigenous people to be able to govern there, and they work in collaboration. And it's really beautiful to see as well, going to Bilwi. I turned on the radio, and you hear programs, community programs run by the Sandinistas, the government that gets funding by the Sandinistas, for indigenous Miskito people to have their own music. So like you'd be I was like on the bus, and I heard like they were playing the local radio station. It's like Radio Caribe, and they had like music, all the like Spanish reggaeton songs in Bilwi, in Miskito, in their language. So like they had programming. In the programming, they had like history of Miskito people and Garifuna people, and it was just cool to see how, the government is not only trying to give land and resources, in control of their own land and resources, but they're also promoting the preservance of their language, of their culture, of everything. And we went there, people are still speaking their language, and it's very beautiful. We also went to, we met with Carlos Aleman, who's the governor of that region, who is Miskito himself, and he's a key person in the Sandinista front. His father was a militant with the Miskito column of the Sandinista front. And he told us, the group ourselves, that without the Sandinistas, the Miskito people would have been in a very different situation now. And interestingly enough, if we look at a map of Honduras and Nicaragua, the Miskito nation goes up into the coast of Honduras as well, in the most eastern province, where the Caribbean Sea is. It's like a corner. And after the revolution, a lot of the Miskito people fled from Honduras down to Nicaragua because they were able to get better opportunities there after the Sandinista revolution. So it was really cool to learn about that. Another thing that was really interesting about Bilwi, the Miskito province, is that we have to remember just last year in 2020, in November, that region was struck by two major hurricanes, Hurricane Eta and Hurricane Iota, within the same month, November 2020, a Category 4 and a Category 5 hurricane that struck the same region. So we're talking about two major hurricanes. And one of the beautiful things is that they reported zero deaths in that department. Let's think about that for a second, because in the US, remember Hurricane Harvey? Remember Hurricane Laura, all the damage that Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico, right? Even in Honduras with those same hurricanes, Hurricane Eta and Iota, hundreds and hundreds of people died in Honduras, which is run by a right-wing neoliberal government, because the government, when they sent troops, they didn't send in troops to bring people out. they sent in troops to defend the banks, to defend the private property of the multinational corporations. They didn't excavate people, and immediately the Sandinista government mobilized the army to evacuate the Miskito people, send them to the city, to Managua, to safe place to stay while the hurricanes passed. So 0 deaths. There was a lot of damages. So we actually got a chance to visit some of the villages that were destroyed by the hurricane. But again, within days, the Sandinista government was already building roofs. They made a promise that they would have a roof over every single house that was destroyed. They're working with the local tribal government to reconstruct the housing. They brought water, they brought food, they cleaned up the schools. So now we visited a school where they reopened a Miskito, where they teach in the Miskito language. So they reopened the schools. So they did everything possible to reconstruct the area after these 2 hurricanes, because of climate change, because of the horrible impact of capitalism and imperialism. So we're seeing not just reconstruction, but also resistance to the impacts of capitalism, of imperialism through climate change. So it was a very beautiful experience to go to the Caribbean coastline to see this, because I saw, lastly, at the coast, we also visited a university called Huracán, the Universidad Regional Autónoma Norte del Caribe, the autonomous regional university, which is a free public education institution for the Miskito people. When I went there, all the murals, all the pictures had the languages of Miskito. We had images of Black and brown people there. They have courses on Miskito customs. They're teaching people how to be engineers, how to be doctors, how to grow the economy locally, so that they don't have to move to Managua and get a city urban job. They can stay in their location. That's one of the big advances of the Sandinista government. They don't want people to cramp into Managua. Like, they don't want that. They're trying to get people to stay in their departments and build the infrastructure there. So they're doing a great job in bridging the contradiction between the rural and the urban, which is something that in the Soviet Union was something that I think Lenin and Stalin were working to build, is to bridge this contradiction. So overall, I mean, there's just so much to say, but that's some of the highlights of what I was able to see.
Well, no, you brought up, you actually, great minds think alike, as they say. When you were describing how they mobilized the people during the hurricane, I immediately thought of Stalin's 5-year plans. It sounds like these are real organizers, and that country is organized, right? And they are organizing to build roads, to raise people out of poverty, to protect the rights of national minorities, and teach the languages that have been suppressed. I mean, this really does remind me of what I've read in like Anna Louise Strong and her book about the Stalin era in the Soviet Union. That's what this sounds like, but interestingly, though, you mentioned national champions, which is what, Vladimir Putin in Russia calls Gazprom and Rosneft, the 2 state-controlled mega corporations that are kind of the center of the Russian economy. The Sandinistas are not an explicitly Marxist-Leninist party, from what I understand. Can you talk about, how is Nicaragua socialist, but how is it different than, like, say, Cuba or North Korea or the former Soviet Union?
So Nicaragua, like many other countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, have a history of Christianity. I think about over 95% of the population is Christian, whether that's Catholic or Protestant. These days, the number of Protestants have gone up a little bit in recent years, but historically it's been predominantly Catholic. Especially Nicaragua in particular, the Catholic Church has a very big role. In neighboring Honduras, we see more, and in Guatemala as well, we see more of a rise of the evangelical Israel supporting church, which is historically right-wing, backed by Reagan, backed by people who represent Zionism. The Catholic Church in Nicaragua, which is dominant, comes from the roots of liberation theology, of this understanding that the socialist teachings of Marx and Lenin can also be found in the Bible and Jesus Christ. And I think one of the beautiful things about Nicaragua and socialism in Nicaragua is that it blends the two. It blends what already exists, which is Catholicism and Christianity, with socialism. So if you travel across the country, you'll see the sign that says, socialism, solidarity, Christianity. You'll also see figures of like Sandino with Jesus Christ, or you'll see Carlos Fonseca, who's the founder of the Frente Sandinista, with Jesus as well. And I think that it's a great way of organizing and mobilizing the population. I think so many times within the United States and just countries in Europe in general, a lot of the left have this kind of purity test or purity spiral where if countries don't exactly align with their atheist view of socialism, they just kind of outright reject it and they say, oh, they're backward on this question. But you also have to respect where the people are coming from. And I think in Nicaragua, people understand socialism in a Christian way, in a Catholic way. And I think one of the interesting things about that is several things. I think one of them being the reverence for agricultural work and labor. In the Bible, we find a lot of concepts related to agriculture and reverence for reaping what you sow, and this concept of like building and that we see in Christianity, which is very prevalent in Nicaragua as well. I think that what we also see is a combination of not only socialism and Christianity, but indigenous practices as well. We know that in Nicaragua, the indigenous Miskitu people on the coast, for example, they combine Miskitu culture with socialist culture and Christian culture. In the West Coast, where you have more people who come from the Cholutega tribe or Nahuatl background, we have combination of indigenous Nahuatl with socialist and Christian values. And so I think it's something that is very beautiful. But I think for me, what struck out the most in terms of the synthesis, the syncretism of socialism and Christianity in Nicaragua that I found really beautiful is the admiration of the family unit. Now, within the synthetic left, one of the big things that they have tried to promote is the disunity of the family. People say they have this idea that all family, the cis hetero family is horrible, is evil, having a man and a woman is toxic. And while on the one hand, for me personally, I have no problem with family units being however you want to define it, whether it's blood, not blood, chosen family, unchosen family, man, woman, that's up to you how you define the family. But I think it's important for me personally to preserve the family unit, because in family there is strength. And that's something that in Nicaragua is very heavily promoted. So in Nicaragua, people are encouraged to have big families. People are in the countryside, families work together to run their land, to grow crops. One of the things that they've noticed is that, in Nicaragua, for example, and not just in Nicaragua, but everywhere, is that there's a dilemma where when you have families in the countryside, a lot of times the children are enticed to abandon their families, move into the urban area, get a wage job, become alcoholics, become drug users. And I'm not going to lie, it's something that I'm not coming at it from like a Puritan perspective. That's stuff that I used to do as well. But in Nicaragua, they're decolonizing that. They're saying, look, you can stay in your areas. We want you to stay with your families. Grow where you're planted is a big aspect of the Sandinista revolution. That's something that's constantly promoted. And part of that is the material, building schools in the countryside, building churches in the countryside, building infrastructure in the countryside, so that people don't get enticed by the urban areas and abandoned. Because they say in Nicaragua, without the campesinos, without the farming class, the families, we're done. This is all done. And that's why they reinforce the family unit. They reinforce the unity of the family, however you want to define that, in any way. So I think for me, that's one of the most interesting things about seeing the synthesis of Christianity and socialism in Nicaragua.
Right. Wow. It's an interesting conversation to have on Sábado Santo, right? The sacred Saturday, right? Because tomorrow is Easter, and in the Latin American Holy Week tradition, right? This is a very important day, the Sábado Santo, right? This is the day before Easter, and it's very interesting to think about that. This reminds me, you're describing how there's kind of a synthesis where they have religion from the indigenous people, they have Christianity, They have Marxism and communism, and they've kind of combined it. And it reminds me of when I would go to Iran. I would go to, these conferences in Iran, the New Horizon Conference, and there'd be communists there, and there'd be, Muslims there, and there'd be like Christians there who are all against American imperialism, all against Zionism. And it actually reminds me, there's a book called Brave New World. Have you ever heard of this? By Aldous Huxley. And basically, the story is that it's like this futuristic society that is like just kind of a gross incarnation of liberalism, where everyone's on drugs all the time, and there's no beauty and all of that, and everything's commodified, right? And this indigenous guy, he like kind of, he's living on a reservation or whatever, and he comes into the Brave New World and sees kind of the horrors of liberalism. But he talks about at one point how on his like indigenous reservation, the people, they practice every religion. They worship Islam, they do Islam, they do Christianity, they do indigenous stuff. And it's kind of like in this like futurist society that Aldous Huxley envisions, right? Where it's like the horrors of liberalism, like all illiberalism, like all religion is kind of combined into one, right? Among the people that are resisting it. And I feel like that's kind of what's happening now. It's no longer about like, are you a Marxist Leninist? Are you a nationalist? Are you a Christian? Are you a Muslim? It's like the whole of humanity is kind of resisting liberalism. There's this Western liberalism, this ideology that says individualism above all else. Money comes first. There is no truth. Truth is all just a matter of opinion. And that's what people all over the world are resisting, whether they're in China, with communism and Confucianism, whether they're in Iran with Shia Islam, whether it's in Latin America with the indigenous traditions and communism and Catholicism. And it's like, it shows that it's about illiberalism versus liberalism. Would you agree with that?
Most definitely. That's something that all over in Nicaragua and all over the world, people have understood that this liberal understanding of the individual as the ultimate being, of urban life being the pinnacle of living, that has all been shattered. And I think especially with the COVID-19 pandemic, that has really been exposed the failures of liberalism, not only classical liberalism, but also the more Democrat, socially progressive liberalism. And I think that it's something that in Nicaragua I was able to experience, because in Nicaragua, the people, it's interesting class dynamic as well, because in Nicaragua, the people who are counter-revolutionary, who support regime change, the people who supported a lot of the 2018 protests, they tend to be more urban, petty bourgeois kids who went to private schools, who don't know necessarily how to work the fields, who don't know how to they like the working class joke is that like they can't even feed themselves. One of the interesting thing is that in 2018, so in Venezuela, they called them the guarimbas, right? Where they will block the roads. And in Nicaragua, they call them the tranques, where they would block the roads. And there came a point where the campesinos in Nicaragua, who are almost all on the side of the Sandinista government, they were like, look, we're not going to produce food for you if you keep blocking the roads. We're not going to send. So it was an interesting dynamic where, in a sense, the opposition in Nicaragua that was based in Managua and the petty bourgeois urban areas were kind of locking themselves out of even being able to feed themselves, because they don't have those skills that people in the countryside have to grow frijoles, to grow tortillas, to grow, the food that they need to survive and sustain themselves. And I think that has been the success of the Sandinista revolution, is having that rural base of campesinos who live this more rural life. And along with that comes, some of the differences in values. For example, the people who support the protests, the right-wing opposition, they tend to have more what we would consider socially progressive values. And people in the countryside have more conservative values. They're more religious, but they're anti-imperialist. So I think that's exactly right. I think the left in general has to really come to understand that we have more in common with socially conservative people who are anti-imperialist around the world, in the material, in the real world, because they're working class people. And a lot of times the people who are espousing these synthetic left views in the urban areas tend to be more pro-imperialist. They tend to be more aligned with the liberal imperialist wing of the ruling class internationally. And I think that seeing Nicaragua with my own eyes, seeing the way that people synthesize religion and anti-imperialism, it's no reason. It makes perfect sense why Nicaragua is aligned with Russia. They have very strong links with the Russian government. They have strong links with Iran. They consider Iran to be their brother revolution. They talk about the Iranians as their brothers because 1979 was also the Islamic Revolution in Iran, where they got rid of Western capitalism. One of the interesting unities between Christian socialism in Nicaragua and Islamic anti-imperialism in Iran is speaking about banks and usury. They talk about how usury is evil, Wall Street is evil, banking is evil, because it talks about creating something out of nothing. And in Nicaragua, they kind of talked about it as like witchcraft, right? As like they talked about it as like these people who don't produce anything, they don't work in the fields, they wear ties, right? They're not creating anything, but they're able to create value out of just numbers and thin air. And it's anti-Christian, it's anti-socialist, and so I think it's really interesting to see that.
Yeah, Karl Marx called it fictitious capital, that their wealth can be created, but nothing is gained for the nation, right? That's Karl Marx talks about it. But the Bible also says that it is a sin to lend money at interest, right? And lending money at interest because you're making money by having money, and no real value is created. And that every religion also, I mean, Judaism, Islam, forbids the lending of money at interest, because ultimately when you have a group of people who make money by just having money, pretty soon they're going to have more money than everybody else, and pretty soon they're going to control the government, and you can't have that, right? And that's why it's forbidden. Let me ask you also, when you spoke to people in Nicaragua, a lot of the critiques that we hear of Nicaragua is that they are very anti-abortion. It's been alleged they're not tolerant of homosexuality. Did you talk about those kind of issues in Nicaragua with people?
Yeah, we actually did. With the family we're staying with, we spoke to some of the younger people who are Christian but are Sandinistas, and they do feel that abortion is wrong. They do feel some people I spoke to do feel that homosexual, they didn't agree with it. But I think there's a very big difference. There was nobody I think there's a difference between not agreeing with something and hating something, right? I think that people associate a lot of times being anti-abortion or being or not believing in homosexuality as like the same as going out and actively beating up people who are doing abortion or people who are LGBTQ, which is a very big difference, right? And I think that most of the people I spoke to in Nicaragua, young people included, while they don't necessarily support abortion or LGBTQ, they don't come at it from a position of hate. It doesn't come from a position of anger, of like, oh, we need to get rid of that. It's not puritanical in any way. It comes more from a perspective of wanting human life, of wanting more families, of growth. Because we have to also keep in mind, right? Nicaragua is a country with a population of 6 million people, just over 6 million people. That's probably like the size of Queens and Brooklyn combined, right? It's
a lot of Puerto Rican Americans are very opposed to abortion because they remember when the U.S. government was sterilizing them,
right.
And that because of that, they feel like, no, we have to not let the white people wipe us out. And that there are African Americans who feel that way as well, that because, the white people have been, sterilizing and trying to wipe out black people, that a lot of groups that have been colonized and faced genocide very strongly feel like it is your duty to reproduce, number one, and also that abortion, that sterilizations, these kind of things are something the white people use to wipe them out. I mean, that is a common belief in many parts of the world that have been colonized, is it not?
That's exactly right. And it's very similar in Nicaragua as well. They say, look, during the Civil War, during the Contra War, there was families that were completely wrecked. They were saying like 1 in 4 people were killed. Millions of people died. Like a lot of people died, and then now coupled with that in the neoliberal era where everybody, we have this horrible thing of like pornography that's ruining marriages, ruining families, right? We have the urban areas that are taking the youth away from the families in the countryside. we have drugs, we have alcohol, all of these things that are not only dividing families, but making people reproduce less and literally killing people's bodies and minds. So in Nicaragua, like a lot of the people I spoke to, they're coming at it not from a position of like, oh, we hate those people, but like we want more people, we want to build, we want big families, we want big communities, because there's strength in numbers, right? When you have more people in a family, you have more people in a nation, you're able to do more things. The human being is the most valuable asset and resource on this planet. And they firmly believe that. They firmly believe that by having more children, having bigger families, they can help uplift the economy. And that's been a big initiative of the Sandinista government, is to help people, government loans for young families. If you're a young family, a young farming family, you're given grants by the government to help grow your local farm. They have instructors from the Agronomy Institute in Managua come to your farm to teach you how to grow new things so you can grow your family, have homesteads in your community. And so it's just really beautiful to see. And I think it's so different from when we think of people in the United States who are, against these things. It tends to be from a position of hate, of anger, and it's not that at all. It's just a different value set. And I think once you're in that context, it kind of makes sense, because you're like, yeah, we need more people. We're a population of just over 6 million people. Like, there's strength in numbers. We want human development and growth. And I think along with that as well, I think it's also this idea that what I think is really beautiful about Nicaragua, going back to the element of understanding of the blending of Christianity and socialism, is they understand the concept of temptation and the concept of the Western capitalism gives you what you want, right? The Nicaraguan people understand this because, for example, they're like, look, the Western capitalists come here, they're like, do you want Pizza Hut? Do you want Domino's? Do you want all this chocolate? Do you want this alcohol? Do you want these drugs? Do you want this urban illusion life of living in the city and doing drugs? And we can give you that if you want to. But the people in Nicaragua, they're like, nope, we had that in the 90s. We're good. We don't want that. We want to stay home with our families. We want to grow fresh food. We want to learn our languages. We want to develop our people and our family. And it's a very mature mindset because, unfortunately, in Honduras, where my family's from, it's very hard because Western capitalism is like that devil that presents a temptation. They come in with their McDonald's, with their Coca-Cola, with their drugs, with their Western lifestyle and illusions. And they say, look, you can have this if you want, but you have to submit what you have to us. Give us your coffee, give us your native grains, give us all of these things. And you kind of give up your nationality, your identity, your clean and good lifestyle for this like illusory Western neoliberal illusion that is nothing. And I think in Nicaragua, because they went through that process so early on, they're like, nope, we're rebuilding what we have, like our foods, our cultures.
Yeah, it's a lot like the text of Dr. Faust, right, by Goethe, right, where it's like, like Satan, you make a deal with Satan, right, and he tricks you kind of. We're like the evil genie that shows up, right, and it's like, it's like your first wish is for a mountain of gold, and then you're like buried underneath a mountain of gold, you know what I'm saying? And
right.
Like when the Soviet Union was falling, a lot of people thought that, oh, okay, we'll get rid of socialism and we'll keep our guaranteed job, keep our guaranteed healthcare and all that, but we'll be able to shop at Walmart. That'll be great, right? They don't understand it's a trade, right? And that this is how the forces of evil work, right? I mean, this is it's like the snake in the Garden of Eden, telling Eve that, the apple's not so bad. It's going to be great. You know what I mean? It's like that kind of thing, right? I mean, that's an interesting analogy how they kind of combine that. Some people think in Lord of the Rings, the way the ring is, was Tolkien was very Catholic, and that it was kind of it was inspired by the Catholic teaching on sin, the ring that Frodo wears and how it kind of takes you over. You think you're using it, but it uses you, etc. So that's very interesting. You touched on the indigenous issue. I always bring this up when I talk about Nicaragua because it's just so important. But, probably the most famous indigenous activist in U.S. history, of AIM, I should say, of 20th century history, was Russell Means. And Russell Means, was a counter-revolutionary in Nicaragua. And he made propaganda against the Sandinista government. And his speechwriter was Ward Churchill. Ward Churchill wrote those speeches. And it's now come out that at the same time, that they were making propaganda about how the indigenous people are being, so oppressed, the Mosquito people are being so oppressed. The CIA was actually hoping to set up a massacre. They were hoping to get the Mosquito people massacred so they could make propaganda. So even as they were claiming to support these indigenous people, they were looking to set them up. They wanted to stage a massacre, basically get a bunch of indigenous people killed to make propaganda against the Sandinistas. I mean, that is so sinister, right? It is deeply, deeply sinister. But it also shows that, like, the synthetic left, they have this kind of weird, like, primitivist view, right? It's like they're not fighting for a prosperous socialist society where everyone has what they need. Instead, they're fighting to, like, to go back to nature or hold back human progress or something. Can you touch on that a little bit?
That's a great point, and I think it's something that Nicaragua is a perfect example of that. Going to this idea of the weaponization of indigenous people and bodies for imperialism against anti-imperialist governments. What's interesting is when we were in Bilwi in Puerto Cabezas in the Caribbean coast, when we were touring the communities that were devastated by the hurricanes, one thing that I found really fascinating was that a lot of the people were saying that at that time, there were a lot of Western reporters and journalists who came to that remote area right after the hurricane and were incessantly asking, where are the bodies? Where are the families? Where are the victims? Because they wanted that story. They wanted that story to be Sandinistas neglect, indigenous families, 10 dead, 12 dead, look what they're doing. And there was nobody. As I mentioned earlier, there was no deaths, right? Yeah. And so they're like, no, we all left in time. The government took us out and we were able to be okay and safe, and they're helping us rebuild. So they went and they have no story. So I think it's interesting that that's still going on today, even with different aspects. But I think it's a great point because that's one of the elements that U.S. imperialism is using in a way to overthrow anti-imperialist governments. I think it's in psychology, it's kind of like this understanding of reflecting, right? Like you reflect onto your enemy what you actually do, because that's what the U.S. government has done, right? The U.S. government has oppressed national minorities. The U.S. government has dislocated indigenous peoples, robbed them of their language, of their land, of their resources. And that's kind of going back to also the biblical elements, kind of like what the devil does as well, right? That evil force, they reflect back onto you what you do to them. And it's really interesting because they try to do that in Nicaragua as well. With the Sandinista government, they say, the Sandinistas displace indigenous peoples, that they don't provide them with resources and power over their land. And it's the complete opposite. From what I saw personally on this delegation, indigenous peoples are in control of their land, they're in control of their food, they're in control of their housing, their education, they run everything. It's an autonomous region. And I didn't even know that. And I've studied Nicaragua for years. Obviously my family's from Honduras. I didn't even know that those regions were considered autonomous. And it's just fascinating because it's something that we never hear about in mainstream media. The Miskitu people, while there were some sectors, right, who unfortunately were won over to people like Russell Means, to people on the synthetic left, to the imperialists, the vast majority of the Miskitu people that I encountered support the Sandinista government. All over the neighborhoods, you see the flag of the FSLN. They love their government and they have an understanding where they want technology. For example, one of the things that there's this institution called the out of Berkeley, there's this NGO. I forget the exact name of it, but they're called there's some hipster NGO out of Berkeley, and they created this hit piece. So they were like, oh, the Nicaraguan government is building a road that's going to devastate the jungles and going to ruin the environment. And all of the Miskitu people I spoke to in the coastline are like, we want that road so that we can get our goods to Managua. We want infrastructure because that's going to help us build our economy here. Because as I mentioned, geographically, the country is divided between the Pacific coast, where it's more mestizo and indigenous people who are in Managua and all the main cities, and the Caribbean coast, where is more Miskitu people, Garifuna people, Afro-Indigenous descent people, and these huge reserves in the middle where it's untouched, preserved land. And so they wanted to build a road to connect, the coast to the capital, so that goods can come in and out to help develop the economy. And the people want that. But it's these random hipsters out of Berkeley who don't want that progress. And they're using that as a way to prevent any sort of development by the anti-imperialist countries, whether they're socialist or not, to develop. And it's one of the ways I think that people have to be very careful of falling into that trick.
Well, Ramiro, I thank you so much for doing this interview, because this sounds like the future of socialism to me. Look, if socialism is ever going to become popular in the United States, we're going to have to learn to be like the Sandinistas. We're going to have to learn to abandon this hipster synthetic left stuff and build a movement like the Sandinistas that is pro-family, that is, that embraces, religion and tradition, that is fighting for working families, that is about building and growing, and this sounds like the future. You've been there, you've seen it. Now I have to get there. As soon as I can possibly get to Nicaragua, I'm getting on a plane.
You got to go out there.
Nicaragua. I got to see this for myself. I have got to see this for myself.
You should try to go in July, because
Okay.
July 19th is the anniversary of the revolution, and this year's an election year. So it's a very big time. So if you wanted to go, I would suggest go July 19th, because this year is going to be big. One last thing before we head out, I'm sorry to interrupt you, Caleb. I just want to say is pretty soon, my goal is by May 1st, I hope to have a documentary out called Nicaragua Against Empire, about my time in the delegation. So that'll be up on my YouTube, youtube.com/Ramiro Sebastian Funez. You could look me up. So I'm hoping to do that. So everybody look out for that. So yeah.
Absolutely. Wow. I can't wait. I will be watching that documentary. I'll be tweeting it out. That'll be great. This is the future of socialism in Nicaragua, it sounds like to me. Thank you so much, Ramiro, for your
Thanks,
time,
Caleb.
for enlightening our viewers about a successful socialist society. Thank you very much.